It's perhaps the most ambitious spending spree Europe has ever undertaken. Europe is rearming. EU military spending is expected to reach nearly €500 billion this year. So the question is no longer just whether Europe will spend, but where the money goes and what power it buys. A vital topic with Europe's security against a potential future war at stake. But Europe is struggling to spend that cash coherently. France and Germany's joint fighter jet has stalled after the companies failed to agree. Now Berlin is considering more American F-35s to bridge the gap. The whole point of shelling out all that money is greater autonomy. Yet European supply gaps send governments to US contractors, tying them to American software, spare parts and political decisions. So is Europe buying the power to defend itself or merely paying hundreds of billions for a new form of dependence? Welcome to The Dip. I'm Daniel. This is your essential podcast for money, power and consequences. And joining me now is Ian Lesser in Brussels, who has spent decades examining what keeps Europe and America together, particularly when trust in defence starts to break down. Thank you for joining us, Ian. And Linus Terhorst researches how Europe's weapons purchases shape its military and industrial independence. Joining us from London. Thank you very much to both of you for taking the time today. Linus, let's just start with you. Do you feel safe?
Personally, I think it's fair to say that I do. I live in a large European city that's far away from ongoing hostilities in Europe and elsewhere. Having said that, of course, I'm acutely aware as a security researcher of the amount of sabotage that is going on against European infrastructure, defense and military infrastructure. The latest we've just heard in Germany at Leipzig airport. And so that is something that is worrying me, and perhaps not an immediate personal feeling of safety that is being lessened there, but certainly a more general sense of a threat.
Okay, and Ian, what is the nightmare scenario that kind of keeps security researchers like you up at night when it comes to security and defense in Europe?
It's good to be with you. I think, there's a kind of professional deformation in this field that we have lots of things that keep us up at night. It's kind of the business. On the other hand, you try not to have it keep you up at night. Originally, I was actually a military historian. And if you think about a lot of the issues that we're confronting today in a bit of historical perspective, you begin to become very anxious because history tells us that even very stable systems, very stable security relationships can go off the rails very quickly. And I think we'd all agree we're living in a moment where things move a lot more quickly today. So I guess what bothers me the most is the sheer unpredictability of the environment we're living in, and also the deterioration of all of these trusted alliances that we've been depending upon for decades.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is security researchers don't get much sleep. Otherwise, they can put it out their mind pretty easily.
I sleep. I don't.
Okay.
There are people who, it doesn't bother me.
All right. Well, Linus, let's get into the ground floor here, okay, and just kind of explain what we mean when we talk about Europe being dependent on the United States for defense. Could you kind of lay that out?
The dependence is quite significant and encompasses multiple dimensions. The first dimension, and that's one that we've been talking a lot about over the past couple of years, is the military presence that the US has in Europe. It is stationing a lot of troops in Europe. It is maintaining a lot of bases in Europe. And it is contributing significant capability into the NATO framework, on which European allies depend when planning for a conflict, for the scenario that they're attacked. So hard military capability, troops and equipment stationed here or made readily available by the US is a significant dependence. Then we also have an industrial angle on it. So there's lots of products, there's lots of intellectual property, there's lots of weapon systems, and so on that are produced, engineered, developed in the US, and then sold to European allies. Some of which are very well known, such as the F-35 aircraft. Some others are, for the usual civilian listener, not quite as much known. But quite a lot of the digital infrastructure, quite a lot of the command and control infrastructure that NATO allies use in Europe is actually American. So there's quite a lot of dependence in that terms as well. And then the broader defense ecosystem and the intelligence that is generated by that ecosystem and upon which security relies and security agencies here in Europe rely is also heavily American. So if you look at the amount, for example, of space-based generated imagery, a lot of that is American.
Right. And so when it comes to actual expenditure, it looks like, nearly half a trillion euros, 454 billion euros, is being spent by the EU member states. So obviously we're not including the UK in that figure, or Norway, or other non-EU countries in Europe. That's like 2.4% of EU GDP. And where that's going seems to be only 53% of it is being spent in Europe, and the rest is going elsewhere. Over a third of it is going to US systems. In aerospace, it's nearly 2/3. And so, Ian, turning to you, could you give us some more of those examples of what is this money being spent on? What does Europe really need from America right now? What is it buying from the US?
Well, as is the case with most defense budgets globally, most of it goes to people. And maintenance and things that don't necessarily shoot, at least not immediately. But if you don't have all of that, and you don't have all the systems and the infrastructure and all the things that contribute to things like military mobility and intelligence, you don't get much for what you have. Just to give you another example, again, in Belgium, a small country, nonetheless, has bought F-35s, extremely expensive system. It manufactures parts of them, and we need to keep that in mind when we talk about American systems that Europe is buying historically. Some of them come from the United States, and they're just used under a license. But in large part, there is co-production everywhere. And a system like F-35, it's very expensive, but the governments make arguments that, well, it contributes to our technological development and innovation infrastructure and employment and all of that kind of thing. But does Belgium really need, if you just want to look at it objectively, why F-35? Well, F-35 for those reasons, but also because it allows Belgium to play in NATO operations further afield. If it were just looking at its own defense requirements, it probably would come to a different conclusion, just as a country like Italy might say, well, we're going to prioritize maritime security in the Mediterranean, for example. Right. It looks very different if you're sitting on in Finland or Sweden.
And the hope is that Europe can somehow reconcile all of that and bring it all together, and that decisions which are made based on individual security requirements can then contribute to the whole NATO need. But Linus, when we talk about things like Germany announcing that it's going to purchase Tomahawk missiles from the US, for example, Germany already makes its own missiles. They don't go as far. These, Terhorst missiles, right? It's going to buy more fighter jets from the US because it couldn't come to an agreement with France as to how to go forward with that joint European fighter jet. So when it buys these things from the US, just briefly, what gaps in Europe's security is it actually filling there? Where are the holes which it needs to plug with these particular technologies?
So, in case of the Tomahawks, a Terhorst is a airborne cruise missile. So it is linked up to a fighter jet or bomber who then flies towards the enemy into contested airspace, and then releases that cruise missile to go the rest of the journey towards its target, which is around 500 kilometers or so. A Tomahawk is in so far different, besides range, is that it can also be used in a ground launcher So you can have vehicles that launch Tomahawks, called Typhoon, which has been developed for the U.S. Army. And that kind of system doesn't really exist in Europe currently. It is meant as a beginning. That purchase is part of a wider issue in Europe which is the lack of precision ammunition that goes quite deep into enemy territory to disrupt command and control and supply lines behind enemy lines. That capability doesn't really exist in a sort of indigenous European way that we developed and produce ourselves. It is under development. It is quite expensive, which means it needs partnering up. That means there's a lot of difficult discussions about how you split up the work, how those jobs that are created are split across the program, and who gets to own what kind of intellectual property within the program, which are the exact kind of questions that have led to the disruption in the FCAS, the German, French, Spanish plan to build a new fighter jet.
Right.
And those kind of questions tend to disrupt quite a lot of European joint projects, which is why we often find ourselves a little bit behind.
Well, you say a little bit behind, but does it make Europe fundamentally weaker? Is that what we're getting at here, that there are these weaknesses, and if we don't buy American, we can't plug these gaps and Europe will continue to be weak?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the American capability is a very good one, and the Americans being happy to deliver that, or even allow licensed production, that, like Ian said, that delivers quite a robust capability to Europe. It's a little bit of a question in what kinds of scenarios you're thinking. Is your scenario that the Americans are simply having to do stuff elsewhere and therefore needing their own production facilities? That means we should be happy with producing American products here in Europe, and therefore that secures our supply chain. Of course, if our concerns are a little bit more strategic than this, if we're concerned that the Americans fundamentally rethink their posture towards Europe and their commitment towards European security, that raises a whole lot of different questions.
Okay. Yeah, so I take that point that whether Europe is weak or not really depends on the scenario that you're supposed to be preparing for. Ian, I just want to look back a bit historically. You mentioned you were a military historian. Well, you had a part to play in history as well when you served on the US State Department's policy planning staff in the mid-90s, at the time when NATO was trying to define its purpose after the Cold War. Do you see this scenario as another one of those turning points where Europe, where NATO are redefining themselves, reasserting themselves, perhaps?
Well, I think, look, this is a moment of not just reflection, but really a demand for change for NATO. There's no question about that. It's in one fundamental way, though, I think very different from that golden age that you were talking about, where I was lucky enough to be in the administration, with the Clinton administration at the time. That was a much more benign period in a way. It was at the end of after the Cold War. And yes, there were doubts, questions about what NATO would do in the future. But it came against the backdrop of a relatively positive a very positive transatlantic relationship, whether we're talking about trade or defense or technology or just mood music across the Atlantic. It was just a different world. Today, we're trying to think through all of these things under conditions of much greater uncertainty and much greater stress, and a very different rhetoric across the Atlantic. I think we're definitely headed towards a more European NATO. I don't think it's a NATO without the United States in it. Obviously political elections make differences, and we have elections coming up, and we'll see what will happen. But for some of the reasons Linus mentioned earlier, including these requirements in the Pacific, the United States probably is going to be doing less in European security in the future unless something dramatic happens. We could talk about the political conditions in the United States, and there's a debate about this. There are a lot in the Senate, in particular, of politicians who really have a much more traditional approach and want to make sure the United States stays engaged in NATO. But I think for all the reasons we're talking about, politics, money, strategy, we're looking at a NATO that is much more European in the future, much more European in terms of spending, capability, command structure. But who's going to set the strategic tone in the alliance in the future? Because it's not just a military alliance, it's also a political one. And the United States has absolutely played that role over past decades. Will it in the future? I'm not sure. But I don't think it's going to be the EU in this. I think we may be in a kind of ironic situation where the EU helps raise money for NATO, which is in a sense what's happening right now. But that might be a fine outcome.
Okay. All right. And Linus, let's just kind of zoom in a little bit more. So when we're talking about being more sovereign, more independent in Europe, it requires companies, industries to take action. And last time we covered German defense, our listener, Kim Mogensen, 4888, said one problem is that German laws are limiting the defense industry and that slow-reacting companies should take chances with investment. And another, Bollwerker, said German military production is conceptually and ideologically stuck in the 70s. So is this dependence, these supply questions downstream from all of these cultural issues about a German mindset that it needs to take more risk, invest more, and, invent more, perhaps?
I'm not sure that's an entirely fair assessment. I would say the culture, having worked with many of those working in industry across Europe, I'd say the culture has changed. People are passionate about helping Europe rearm and therefore helping Europe to stay safe. There's a willingness to go ahead and invest and to take risks, but there needs to be a little bit of a policy that goes along with that. And so if you want to look into the nitty-gritty of how we do procurement across Europe, there's lots that we can learn from what the US are doing in terms of embracing innovation, in terms of assuring companies that are considering strategic investment into new production sites, into developing new products and so on, that there's a market for these things and that their investment can indeed pay off. And part of that is creating a European defense market that works a little bit more coherently than it currently does. It's still today, we have a very strong preference for national products and for national developments. That means that as a company, you need to really be careful to invest into additional production capacity, because you might end up with a capacity in the wrong kind of country that you then therefore can't sell into another one. And that's a problem across Europe. It's not a German problem. It's not a French problem. It's not a British problem. Of course, there are differences and nuances. But one of the biggest challenges we face today in Europe is the failure to aggregate demand, and therefore giving industry a clear demand signal about how it can invest, where it can invest, which kind of products, and which kind of production capacity makes sense for the next 10, 20 years.
Okay, and Ian, it reminds me of a debate which I've had with CEOs here in Germany about digital sovereignty, and another kind of important aspect, where they've essentially said, yes, we want to build up our capabilities, but the fact is we have built a world which is interconnected, where you have to draw on the advanced capabilities of other countries, and to completely divorce yourself from that is just not possible. So how do you see that with defense? Is the idea of a European defense autarky simply unworkable?
I think, autarky is one thing, but is this, I think, a basic question for you. I mean, sitting here in Brussels as an American, it strikes me that most Europeans are much more comfortable talking about these issues as industrial policy than as defense policy. There will be more money made available. The question of what you buy and who is making it, these are going to be political choices for sure. But there's a much less advanced debate about what the strategy should be. And I would say even more importantly, the strategic culture in Europe. I think this is very obvious in Germany, but it's also obvious in other places where, yes, you can buy all sorts of things, but our society is willing to go and fight, and for what and for who. This is an extremely important thing. And then when you get to this this question of, what are you buying with this capability? It's everything from supply chains for drones to the strategic nuclear deterrent and all the things that go into that, and that has been very heavy, with the exception of the French. Even some of that has been very heavily American as well. How do you make all of that work? We haven't really had a close look at some of these things since the height of the Cold War, to be honest. And it was always assumed that if you wanted to have an American nuclear umbrella in Europe, ultimately, as a guarantee of security, you also had to have Americans on the ground in Europe as a tripwire, let's be honest. And if that tripwire goes away or it becomes too small, can you still count on this nuclear umbrella, even if the United States is willing to provide it? I mean, those are the kinds of questions I think people are very uncomfortable asking about. They are much more comfortable debating questions of tech sovereignty and employment from defense industries, rightly. I was in a setting recently with a number of different defense executives asking exactly this question. Would sovereignty concerns be an impediment to European defense innovation in the future? And they, by and large, said yes. They acknowledged, as Linus was saying, that it would be much more efficient to be able to have, effective transnational collaboration. But at the end of the day, if you have to raise money from societies that aren't sure about it, you better be able to show that there's some national benefit. Add to that the increasing anxiety, not just in defense, but in a number of different sectors, about whether the U.S. is reliable. The idea about kill switches and so on, for example. The United States turn off the access to all the sort of data and the maintenance and all the rest of it that goes along with these systems. I don't think that's likely, but I understand people are increasingly worried about it.
Yes, and even then, if there were kill switches built into let's say the servers that run the AI which power the military decisions which need to be made in the future, Europe cannot just make its own GPU chips that are currently made by Taiwan and stack its servers. With that, it just doesn't have the massively complex supply chain in order to make that kind of thing happen. And this comes at a time when war may not look like it did before. We mentioned earlier the attack. It seems to be an attack. I don't know how much details we have on it, of this Ukrainian airplane that was in Leipzig by a drone. And these incidents seem to be becoming more common, of that maybe sabotage. I mean, that is also a kind of warfare in itself which is taking place, which presents more complexity in these challenges that we're dealing with. I mean, what is war these days, and defense, and what does that even look like? And I think Europe is still getting its head around that in some sort of ways. And that brings me to my final question for you, Linus. If Europe cannot be able to do more of it itself, stand on its own 2 feet, what is kind of the worst case scenario that we're looking at here?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and an uncomfortable one. No, the worst case is that we find ourselves in a scenario in which the US is militarily active elsewhere, and therefore can't commit to help Europe if it's attacked, and if such an attack then happens. We find ourselves without the help in terms of troops, in terms of technology, in terms of intelligence that we are used to operate with in conjunction with the Americans, and that would. I wouldn't say that would necessarily make us hugely inferior to the likely adversaries out there in the European theatre, but it would certainly make the fight a lot harder than with the Americans.
Right, and finally, my question to you, Ian. So you've already mentioned that this kind of, not even quite a pivot away from Europe, that's putting it too strongly, but this questioning of how much support the US would be willing to give to Europe. You mentioned, you've written before, that it's not just a Trump issue. It's been a question that has been a long time coming, and one that Europe should have dealt with earlier, in fact. But if Europe is attacked, Ian, do you think that the NATO alliance under Trump, as it stands, that it will hold?
I think it will. You have to ask the question of attack. Attack of what kind by whom. I mean, you gave a very relevant example a few moments ago when you were talking about new kinds of hybrid warfare and drones and murky non-state actors, maybe in someone's pay, maybe not, cyber war, all these kinds of things. Would they trigger NATO's Article 5? Well, there's some misunderstanding about Article 5. There's this assumption that it's somehow something automatic. It's not. It's a political decision. And so what allies actually feel about each other and feel about the threat that are out there matter. Yes, I still do think the United States is committed to the alliance, and in the event of a kind of high intensity contingency, something really very demanding where, Europe needs the help, the US will be there. But, you have to worry about something else, which is not just, I would say, deliberate, slow-moving kinds of aggression, planned, etc., but things simply going wrong. Things can go wrong with Russia in the Black Sea or in the Baltic or elsewhere in Europe that would get you into a chain of escalation where Europe would need help. And similarly, things can go wrong for the United States in Asia with China that would accelerate this shift in American emphasis and just simply draw the United States away in a way that would make it less able to come to Europe's assistance. And sometimes these things can come together. So, I mean, to come back to your original question of what should keep people up at night, doesn't keep me up at night, actually, because otherwise I wouldn't sleep very much. But if you were to come back to that question, I think that's what I would worry about, the chances of things simply going wrong.
Okay, well, I mean, it's a complicated topic with shifting sands all over the place, so many different ways of analysing it. So it's been a pleasure to speak to you both, Ian Lesser and Linus Terhorst. Thank you for navigating us around this difficult subject. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Good to be with you.
That's it for this week on The Dip. Thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to leave a comment or a question. Any feedback is welcome wherever you're listening to this or watching it too. And if you're not subscribed in the podcast app of your choice, go ahead and do so. Just look for The Dip. Until next time, thank you very much for watching.